Imagine crawling on your stomach through a pitch-black steel tube, barely over 1 meter wide, for 15 kilometers. Oxygen is sparse. Decades of built-up gas vapor contaminate what little air there is to breathe. You pass out, but someone quickly wakes you. Trailing are a dozen other soldiers, all enduring the same conditions, all annoyed that you are blocking their path. Ahead, somewhere, there is an exit. Oh, and that is the easy part. As soon as you emerge, a drone is waiting to hunt you down before you can regain your bearings. This is not a work of fiction. This is how Russia tried to capture a small but strategically important city in northeast Ukraine. And it almost worked, if not for a larger vulnerability that Russia had left behind. It may be the most absurd battle of the Russia-Ukraine war. It features the legacy of Brezhnev, a declaration of victory that jumped the gun, a bold appearance at the battlefront, a microcosm of the evolution of infantry assaults, and a counterattack for the ages. This is the Battle of Kupiansk. Prologue. Kupiansk is, or was, a small city in the northeast of Ukraine, pre-war population of about 27,000, but its strategic importance overshadowed those numbers. For one thing, the Oskol River cuts directly through the city. I have enlarged the river here to reflect its importance for later, but at times the width of the Oskol shrinks to about 25 meters near the heart of Kupiansk. For another, it intersects two major highways, the P07 and the P79. Head west, and you eventually will reach Kharkiv. Head north or south, and you follow the path of what Moscow calls Novorussia. This line is the administrative division between Luhansk Oblast to the east and Kharkiv Oblast to the west. That corresponds to what the Russian Federation calls an international border. Kupiansk is also an energy transit point. In 1981, the Soviet Union constructed a gas pipeline just north of the city, designed to supply Ukraine with gas via a routing station just on the other side of the border with Russia. Following the annexation of Crimea in 2014, Ukraine halted gas purchases from Russia. In the years afterward, Gazprom worked on plans to dismantle the section of pipeline on its side of the border. Ukraine, meanwhile, kept the pipeline idle. Removing it was expensive, and it was possible to reverse the flow and use the pipeline to move imported gas from Europe eastward. As things stood, an empty steel tube, roughly 1.2 meters wide, just quietly rested underground. Any questions about refurbishing it evaporated on the morning of February 24, 2022. Vladimir Putin announced a special military operation, and Russian soldiers began streaming across the border from the north, from the east, and through Crimea. While Kyiv stood strong, resistance in Kupiansk evaporated. Its mayor surrendered 3 days later and would be indicted for treason the day after. For more than half a year, the city remained under Russian occupation as the ad hoc capital of the Kharkiv Oblast, with Russia having failed to take Kharkiv itself. However, September 2022 marked the beginning of Ukraine's fall counteroffensive. Blue and yellow forces used the P07 highway as a guide for their eastern push. On the 9th, the first salient appeared in the region. By the 10th, Ukrainian troops had made their way into the city. On the 11th, they began fanning outward along the Oskol River. On the 12th, it was the south side. Around this time, the Kremlin recognized that the situation was militarily untenable and took two major steps to resolve what was on the verge of becoming a catastrophe. The initial step came on September 21st, when Putin again took to the airwaves to announce the mobilization of Russian reservists. It would quickly become an incredibly unpopular policy, so much so that Putin would spend the next few months rolling it back and replacing the recruitment system with voluntary contracts. The second was to formally annex Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson into the Russian Federation. The purpose of this was to provide a legal rationale to send Russian troops to those regions for defense. Notably, the Kharkiv Oblast, home of Kupiansk, was not part of it, something that will become notable again later. Still, Ukraine made further progress, albeit at a slower pace. By the beginning of November, Russia was trying to hold on to the northern section of the P79 highway. Further south, Russian troops were almost back to the border with the Luhansk Oblast. It remains the high point in the war for Ukraine, The offensive came to a natural end as the fall flipped into winter. Rain and slush turned dirt into mud, rendering Ukraine's motorized battle plan infeasible. Meanwhile, mobilizing hundreds of thousands of fresh soldiers paid off for the Kremlin. Russia built up its defenses, and Ukraine failed to initiate a successful offensive in the spring of 2023. The war was turning again. Act 1. Frontal Assault. About 2 years passed without serious movement near Kupiansk, but toward the end of 2024, Russia began a new campaign for the city. Initially, the main efforts were to hug the river and press along north and south of Kupiansk, leaving a gap in the middle. But on November 13th, Russia made a stronger play by sending 2 armored columns directly into the city along the eastern bank. Once there, they dispersed inside of the urban setting and called for reinforcements as a standard part of Russian offensive operations. However, this was well after frontline infantry tactics had predominantly switched over to FPV drones. Tanks and armored personnel carriers had taken a back seat along established fronts because it was way too easy for a drone to destroy millions of dollars of equipment. Yet Russia pressed on anyway. Now, why that was the case is unclear. Part of it may have been political. Ukrainian commanders believed that Putin had set a deadline of November 1st to capture Kupiansk. That had passed 2 weeks earlier, and now local commanders were feeling pressure to have positive news to report before Putin's New Year's address. The other part may have been fog. It was thick on the day of the assault, and Russia may have been attempting to sneak the heavy equipment through. FPV drone operators do not do as well when the battle is right on top of them. Either way, it did not work. Ukraine discovered the infiltration and destroyed the armored vehicles. Over the next 6 hours, Ukraine's own infantry dispatched the stragglers from the first wave. 2 weeks later, Russia withdrew from the outlying sections of the city. Act 2. A pocket and a flank. The Battle of Kupiansk was ultimately about the Oskol River, and that is where Russia pursued Plan B. Remember, Russian troops had already pushed up against the river both north and south of the city, returning the pressure straight down the middle, this time with drones and dismounted infantry, would create a pocket of sorts, with the river acting as the final component. The river was still passable to retreat across, but it would nonetheless create logistical problems for Ukraine to resupply. The other option that Russia could pursue was to flank Kupiansk. Rather than fight across a river to enter the well-defended city, Russia could instead use the parts of the river that it had reached to establish 1 or 2 beachheads on the western side. Then it could pinch Ukrainians bunkered in Kupiansk or surround the city and lay siege. This second option carried with it a strong political message. Russian law only recognized Ukraine's 4 eastern oblasts as a part of the Federation. Now, administrative lines do not always match up with militarily defendable territory, and this is one such case. If the Kremlin intended to stop the war once the line of control included all of its codified boundaries, then there was no need to cross the river. Simply take the territory up to it, and use the river as a defensive fortification to consolidate your claim. Continuing to attempt to occupy Kupiansk instead signaled an intent to take all of the Kharkiv Oblast, and maybe more. Ultimately, Russia focused on the second option, and specifically zeroed in on the northern route. On November 26th, Russia claimed to have crossed the Oskol and entered a settlement. At the end of the month, a second bridgehead formed just south. By this point, it had become clear what Russia's strategy was, and Ukraine attempted to reinforce the area. In early December, Ukrainian forces successfully removed Russia from the first beachhead. However, by the end of January, Russia had consolidated the second beachhead. The Kremlin's first step in the larger plan was accomplished. It had successfully established a presence west of the river. For the next 6 months, Russian forces slowly progressed south, using the standard 1- and 2-man teams to push forward, establish hiding spots, and evade Ukrainian drones. At the end of July, the front line had moved to the edge of Kupiansk itself. The real battle was about to begin. Act 3. Attack and counterattack. At the beginning of August, Russia began sending those same 1- or 2-man infiltration teams into the city. This immediately caused problems for Ukraine's defenders, which at this point relied on drones to halt any advances. Out in open fields, Russian soldiers are easy targets. Once in a city, everything has a roof, and everything therefore becomes a good hiding place. Yes, somehow the advent of drones has made the relative difficulty of urban combat even harder. There was still the problem of implanting Russian soldiers into the urban environment, though. Mad dashes through open spaces are not advisable. And that is how we end up back at the Brezhnev-era pipeline saga. Recall that Ukraine had left the pipeline idle, hoping to one day put it back to use and not wanting to pay to properly dismantle it. But the pipeline seemed to resolve Russia's entry problem. Simply have men get in from a safe location, crawl underneath no man's land, and emerge somewhere directly inside of Kupiansk. One Ukrainian officer estimated that hundreds of Russian soldiers tried just that. Well, the strategy probably did not work well for anyone involved. The troops crawling through the pipeline fell into a stupor as they crawled up to 15 kilometers in search of an exit. When they finally emerged, they tended to walk around aimlessly, their brains not having recovered from oxygen deprivation and inhaled residual chemicals. But they still posed a problem for Ukrainian troops, who spent weeks playing cat-and-mouse games, trying to search for the latest exit point so that they could seal it. Nonetheless, the fact was that Russia had made advances into the city, and the Kremlin was ready to celebrate. On November 20th, Putin visited the West Group's command post and got the update from Chief of the General Staff, Valery Gerasimov. The West Group of forces have liberated Kupiansk and are now eliminating encircled Ukrainian formations on the eastern bank of the Oskol River. Except that is not what was happening. Gerasimov was claiming that the city was captured and that the pocket had fully formed. Concurrently, though, the map looked like this. Russia had indeed stepped foot in Kupiansk, but the city was merely contested. Ukrainian forces east of the Oskol still had the ability to retreat if it was necessary, which it was not. To the contrary, Russia had a more structural problem on its hands. It had pushed a salient south along the river. Salients are fine. In fact, they are often exactly how you want to start a battle. But you cannot leave them like that for the long term. The element of surprise is what keeps them from collapsing. And there was the rub. In the interim, Russia had hardly made progress in enveloping Ukrainian soldiers on the eastern side of the Oskol. This created an opportunity for Ukraine. Cut through the salient, and whatever soldiers had made it into Kupiansk would no longer have access to supplies. And that is precisely what happened. Around December 10th, Ukraine indeed collapsed the salient. On December 12th, Zelensky visited the main entrance to the city, with live fire audible in the background. He was essentially mocking Putin, summarily rejecting the notion that it was in Russian hands. The Kremlin cried foul, claiming that the video was an AI fake, and illustrating how the problem with modern technology is less about producing lies and more about casting doubt on the truth. The next few months focused on cleanup operations, with some starving Russian troops hiding in basements for weeks at a time. Interspersed were various claims from the Kremlin that Kupiansk was in Russian hands, and further interspersed were videos featuring proof to the contrary, like the Ukrainian flag flying above the city council building. Russia had failed to take Kupiansk. Epilogue. Despite the battle raging for more than a year and a half, it is still too soon to call it over, despite Russia's failures. At the time of recording, Russian troops remain west of the Oskol River, to the north of the city. The Kremlin still has its sights set on liberating Kupiansk, and it would not be surprising if yet another battle for the city commences in the future. And there are no guarantees regarding the outcome of a future battle. In April 2026, media reports surfaced of Ukrainian soldiers starving within the semi-pocket east of the Oskol, the river having complicated standard resupply missions. However, the battle was an early signal of what was to come in the medium term. A few months after Ukraine secured the city, the overall territorial exchange figures flipped in Kyiv's favor, and one of the main underlying factors there, Ukraine's new medium-range drones designed to eliminate Russian logistics, promised to complicate further Russian efforts in the region. But the war rages on. If you enjoy this type of retrospective, then I have great news for you. I have an entire playlist of them, mostly concentrated on the earlier phases of the war. This is the first of these that I have done in a long time, and I enjoyed putting it together. Meanwhile, if you enjoyed today's video, then please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you tomorrow. Take care.